Okay. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Terra Prime Live SwordLab. We are here with our panel of experts tonight. Damon Honeycutt, Ben Judkins, and Jared Miracle joining us here. Tonight we are talking about authenticity in the martial arts. This is something that's come up. We brought it up last week, so we're kind of expanding on the topic tonight. Because it is a very interesting topic, especially when we're talking about historical martial arts, accuracy, and all of this stuff that's brought up when we're talking about different martial arts and giving, you know, what amounts to certain value judgments nowadays. So we'll kind of start off with this. Everybody's got something good to say. I know me and Jared we'll probably talk about Count Dante in this particular milieu quite a lot, but we'll go there. I think the first thing we should do is start framing the kind of argument here, because I think what happens, and Ben brought this up last week, and which kind of led to this whole thing, which is there seems to be a semantic disconnect with the way people are thinking about this to start off with. Now, you take the word authentic, and it's usually, when you're talking about authentic martial arts, they're usually contrasted with fantasy martial arts, or something that's called fantasy. However, fantasy is not the opposite of authenticity. Fraud is. So placing fantasy in that box gives people the idea that fantasy is fraud. Now, this is not necessarily the case. Obviously, fantasy, fraud, fake, all of these things kind of get muddled in together. And that's where this kind of idea is going to come into play, because we think of words as having meanings and having, you know, very good compartmentalized. We just plug them in and that's what they are. And that's not really how words operate linguistically. There's a couple of different models out there and stuff like that. One, distributed morphology, which says you have these kind of clouds of meaning, which this word can kind of fit into in certain contexts and all of that kind of thing. And so you never really have a precise definition of any one particular word, unless it is a word that's given that for a specific thing, and which is why we use Latin in medicine and naming things and stuff like that, because those words don't change, so we don't have to worry about them being non-specific. Anyway, so that's where we are. We've got this thing, authentic martial arts, we've got fantasy martial arts, and we've got fake martial arts, right? And where do these all kind of come together, and are these even interesting things to think about? Because, as we're going to be talking about, the idea of authenticity itself, not fraud or not fake or not fantasy, fraud, all that kind of stuff, that's kind of easy to handle, compartmentalize, take in. What's hard is what's authentic. What are we calling authenticity, and what's that kind of thing. So that's where we'll open up the discussion tonight. First of all, when we're talking about authenticity, and when most people use the word authentic martial arts, what do we think they usually mean? I'll open it up to everybody. Anybody who wants to jump in on that one.
Ancient, unchanging, the way my grandfather did it.
Right, yeah, that's a good one. Definitely. I think it's called the fallacy of the beard.
Also, like, people always say, how effective is it in this situation or that situation?
Right, yep.
The situational effectiveness to it. Is it effective one-on-one? Is it effective in a life or death situation? Can I defend myself with this, that kind of thing?
Right, yep.
I'd throw out that it meets some kind of vague but predetermined idea that the person is looking for.
Right.
Kind of playing off what Damon said, does it work in the cage, or does it have an old Asian man teaching it, or
right. Yes, exactly. I think all those things are very good things, and I think we can look at a lot of them in a way. Let's start off with the ancient thing. Number one, let's talk about just the age of things anyway. That right there is generally hyperbole in a lot of cases, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and it's a culturally determined hyperbole. You know, when we talk about martial arts, right, very often we should specify that what we're actually talking about is East Asian martial arts, right? You know, there's HEMA, there's other things, but typically when you say martial arts, people like Jared, you know, mentioned, they imagine an old Asian guy, right? And there you immediately put yourself into the realm of Confucianism, right? And that carries a bunch of cultural values with it, right? And one of the cultural values is I do not create, I do not innovate, I teach, right? There was a golden age as it existed in the past where they had it all figured out. And the best thing that you can do is not screw this up, right? So you convey what you learned to the best of your ability. And this is not an idea that is confined to the martial arts, right? This is a general cultural understanding of pedagogy across all kinds of things, right? You know, when I deal with Chinese graduate students, you know, who take my lecture notes and rewrite them and hand them back to me as their research paper, and I'm like, no, that's not how this actually works here in America. You know, you have to go do something creative, and I get to explain this over and over and over again, right? So in a sense, we're dealing with a set of values that American martial artists or European martial artists have acculturated into.
Yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, obviously, I think that the ideas of authenticity come into HEMA a lot right now too, but we can get into that because that's a kind of that's in a little different way.
You know, karate historically ends up making a really interesting example of what we're talking about here with the systems of pedagogy, because karate is not Japanese, right? It's Okinawan. Okinawan is a lot more relaxed, chill. It's a tropical, I mean, it's a tropical archipelago. So the culture there is, I mean, until very recently, it's radically different from Japan, which is that, you know, strict Neo-Confucian style of everything. So when servicemen go to Okinawa during and shortly after World War II, and they're learning karate, and then they show back up in the States, and we have guys like Robert Trias opening the first karate school in the mainland, they're not teaching that based on some kind of Okinawan order of how you learn things. The reason they're saluting flags and marching around in you know, cube-shaped organization, it's because it's what they learned in the military. And they spent, you know, 3 to 8 years doing that. So that was how they understood the world to work.
Yeah. Yep. Everything's going to have context, right? And if that context changes, the thing can be ill-equipped or look really out of place. That's something that can always happen. Does it make it less authentic? Right? I don't know. Who says? Right? Is there even such a thing as inauthentic skill? I mean, you either have skill or you do not.
Yeah, I don't think having no skill is inauthentic skill. That's just bad. It's just no skill.
Right. Exactly.
You know, it's just like, you know, there's people, you can train all you want, but if you just, even if sometimes people are just not, maybe they're really theoretical, but they're not in tune with their body. That doesn't mean they're inauthentic in their practice. Or maybe some people are really good in their body, but they just don't know how to, they're not a thinking artist, you know. It's like, it doesn't make one more authentic than the other. You're absolutely right. It's a skill scale, right? Skill scale.
And I think we need to separate that out from discussions of authenticity, because what happens is authenticity is intentionally used as a slippery term.
Yeah.
Right. You know, we fold things into it, like you were saying, right? We fold into the notion that if you had a great teacher and your teacher was skillful, therefore, if you are of that authentic lineage, you should also be skillful. And if I say I have authentic Ip Man Wing Chun, all that means is I learned from a teacher who learned from a teacher who learned from Ip Man, right?
Mhm.
It does not mean that my Wing Chun is as good as Ip Man, right? I may authentically be part of this social continuum through time, whether I'm any good at it, right? We make that association because we are motivated by a set of values, maybe to advertise my school, right? Maybe to give myself a sense of self-worth because I'm part of this great lineage. But when you begin to break down, authenticity's got to have a reference. I got to have a referent. And generally speaking, people kind of assume skill is part of that referent. But when you really push them on it, you find out that that's more of an assumption than something that they're kind of consciously processing.
I agree with you on that, Ben. There's a lot of assumptions that go into things, and I think it's easy. I think when people assume it's easy, you don't have to go and find out. It's like theory, it can be in your head, but practice, there's this strong dividing line between the two. And it's easier for me. Oh, this person has this. Oh, I'm just going to assume that's it. And sometimes a beginner has someone who's freshly looking at this stuff. They don't know where to start anyhow. So they got to start somewhere.
Right. And I think that's, you bring up a good point there with beginners, because a lot of times when we first start out, I know that's one of our big concerns is like, is it authentic? Is it what am I getting what I'm paying for or what I'm investing in, and we it's funny because we seem to come up with this question and we never define what it is that we're talking about, right, to ourselves, right? So it's like, am I getting out of this what I'm putting into it? It's like, I don't know. What did you want to get out of it? It's like, and if you ask the average student, they'll kind of hum and haw, whatever. You can usually tell students who will leave after a few lessons by asking that question.
So as I was contemplating what we wanted to possibly have as talking points this afternoon, I came up with what I think is an interesting case study that I would like to throw out there for everybody.
Okay.
And I think this will be fun because, as far as I know, I'm the most familiar with this, and I'm not even all that familiar with it. But it's outside of everyone's wheelhouse collectively, so this should give us a good pivot point. This guy. This is a Japanese man. He's a martial arts teacher named Jun Osano. Lives in South Yamanashi Prefecture next to Mount Fuji. He's a very nice guy. He's a high school teacher. I believe he recently retired. The thing about Jun Osano is that he has, like, I don't know, 20 different, he's like lineage holder in like 20 different historical Japanese martial arts, like Koryu, old school stuff. Super legit, checks out, has the scrolls. I've seen it myself, been to his dojo. The thing is, he also teaches them, and he doesn't have licenses from the lineage owners to teach them. So he gets in trouble. This book in particular is about Yagyu Shingon style jujitsu. Totally legit. Everybody agrees. He's registered. He has all the right paperwork. He's got the skills. He's flipped me on my head more than once. But he technically is not teaching because he doesn't have the right license. He has all the information, but are his students learning authentic jujitsu from him because they're not official lineage holders according to his teacher? I have no answers. I'm just throwing it out there.
I like this guy already.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, that's just so it's just so bureaucratic, right?
Well, that's lineage. I mean, lineage is just this. We've put so much
So Jerry,
emotion into such a bureaucratic thing.
Yeah. So okay. So how much? I don't know the answer to this, so I'm throwing it out there. How much bureaucracy was added during or after the Meiji Restoration?
Pretty much all of it. Yeah, we don't, I mean, so really, like, modern bureaucracy in Japanese martial arts really starts to pick up in the 1930s, because it was hand in hand with that, like, ultra nationalization that they went through before World War II. And so then they shut everything down right after World War II, but then 3 years later they're back at it. And to this day, it's martial art, like Japanese martial arts in Japan are super nationalistic, which for the Japanese, as we all know, means super heavy on paperwork.
Do you think that this teacher that you know is just kind of like anachronistic, like he's just kind of out of time, like in the wrong time? Do you know what I mean by that?
If I think I get what you're going for.
Like he's just so, let's say, for lack of a better term, old school, that the new school just doesn't even know what to do with him.
See, that's the thing. If you did this exact same scenario 200 years ago, there would be a price out on his head because he's violating Japanese tradition so much. So if he's out of time, he's like 100 years before he should have been born.
Okay, but there's also, if he does have really great skill, maybe
he does have great skill.
Yeah.
Right?
So he has supreme skill. These people say, "Oh, let's put a price on his head," but we honor his skill so much that we'll just make that price too high for anybody to come up with. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of what it sounds like to me. It's just like, this guy is too big. He's kind of like, he's like Batman. He's just too big. You know, policing God for his old.
He sort of makes me think of Sun Wukong. Like, he goes and he learns from the old man, he gets all the skills, and the last thing the old man says is, "Okay, now whatever you do, don't tell anyone I was your teacher."
Yeah, seems why I like this guy.
I mean, he's been pretty well disowned by.
He was a school teacher?
He is or was. I don't know if he's retired in the last couple of years.
That's awesome.
You know, nice enough guy, kind of has an ego on him, but who wouldn't at that point? But he's pretty well been disowned by the entire Japanese martial arts community, including his teacher.
Well, that's kind of very Sun Wukong too, right? Or Sun Goku, right? He kind of had an ego. He needed to get a headband to keep that in check.
It's interesting. So he only ends up having like 3 Japanese students, and all the rest of them are in Eastern Europe.
Huh. Aren't there other teachers in Japan that are like that?
There are a handful, and they tend to be really strange people by Japanese standards.
So, like, let's take Masaki Hatsumi, right? I mean,
my own
he has
teacher.
a lot of non-Japanese students. He has tons.
See, that's
he's a pretty unique fellow.
Yes, you're definitely right about that. Oh, the stories. What I like about the comparison between Osano and Mr. Hatsumi is that Jun Osano, as far as I can tell, as far as anyone seems to be aware in the classical Japanese martial arts community, he's not lying. Mr. Hatsumi is willing to play fast and loose with facts and information.
Interesting. That I did not know.
Yeah, he's not looked on very kindly by the Japanese martial arts establishment, whereas Osano just ticks everybody off because he doesn't sit within the framework of, like.
Well, it also sounds like his name's Osano Sensei.
Osano, yeah.
Osano, yeah. It seems like if you said does he have a lot of students? Does he have a few students? Is it just so, this to me sounds like a very personal, right? it's like he has it, but it's so personal that he's just gonna do it how he does it.
I think he would be extremely happy to be like Mr. Hatsumi with thousands and thousands of students. He just, between his personality, teaching style, and the fact that anyone legit says don't train with that guy, I think he's sort of shot himself in both feet. To the extent that he ended up going to Taiwan a few years back and getting some kind of a teaching license in some style of Gong Fu I'd never heard of.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he's a weird dude. But
Well,
the reason I bring it up is
all got our struggles.
that's true. But does that mean, if we tie this into the lineage thing, does lineage then directly connect with authenticity?
I mean,
If
in
his
this
skills
case,
are
yeah, right? Because we're talking about culturally bounded systems here, right? Yeah, the entire, you know, we only talk about, I think, authenticity in this extent because we were indoctrinated to do that by our teachers.
All
And
right.
in the Japanese system, it is very clear that, you know, he is not an authentic teacher, ergo, his students are not members of these lineages.
So what's to stop him? And this is the next great question of authenticity. What's to stop him to be like, okay, the powers that be don't acknowledge me. I've done this stuff for 60 years. Everybody knows that I'm good at what I do. I have everyone's respect for my skill. They might not like me, but I got their respect. This is my personification of this, and I call it something else.
Right. So that's the really interesting question. I just actually wrote a biography on my blog of a martial artist named Fujin Song, who's one of the 5 southbound tigers in Chinese martial arts history, and you know, starts off as a Bagua student. Actually, starts off as a Chen Tai Chi Chuan student before he's anything else. You know, back before Chen Tai Chi is a thing, he's studying with the Chen family. But you know, ultimately makes it as a Bagua master. Does Xing Yi, does Wudain's sword, studies with everybody. Is sponsored by all of the right warlords. Like, you know, every bandit who became a general loves this guy, right? You know, they're all giving him jobs. And eventually, when he retires in the South, he says, all right, now I'm going to synthesize it all, and I'm going to give you Fu style. And it's like, Fu style what? It's like Fu style everything, right? He's got his Fu style Bagua, he's got his Fu style Tai Chi, he's got his Fu style, you know, basic training exercises, right? And he is able to convert that social capital that he had into a type of creativity that seems to kind of transcend this normal discussion of authenticity, right? You know, no one's asking him if his Fu style is authentic, but people are willing to accept it nonetheless.
But he still, from what I understand, he still calls it Fu style Bagua.
You know, it's
right, or Fu style, whatever. He doesn't call it completely different.
It's Fu style, and then within that, he teaches Bagua, he teaches Tai Chi, teaches Xing Yi.
So he kind of just created his family umbrella. People were
He did. He creates his own family umbrella.
That's awesome.
And that's not necessarily uncommon. I mean, we've got Masha Tongbei is the same way, and yes, you've got Baji, you got Fanza, and all that kind of stuff. And plus, I think that was also kind of fairly common back in the Republican era too, because so many of our Taiji styles are sort of like that. They're like, this guy just start like Wu style, Wu Jin Chen style, right? You've got it. He's a student of Yang Ban Ho. He teaches, I don't know, some you know, some palace guards or something like that. Then, like down the road, voila, whole style. And it doesn't differ too much from Yang style.
So this brings me back to a real strong innovator of the 20th century. Well, outside of, what about Morihei Ueshiba? Right. I mean, yeah, like he really changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think he was very different in his youth than he was as an old older man. And I think a lot of people personify him as the older O-sensei, and the younger O-sensei, I don't think people talk about. I think he was pretty rough and tumble when he was younger, if I remember right. But so I mean, but his innovations were incredible, and people seem to very accept those. Maybe it was because of the skill thing there as well. I'll have to look at him more with that in mind.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, if somebody has enough skill that they distinguish themselves, I'm sure the powers that be tend to calm down and will at some point want to start to share in that spotlight.
Well, Yu Chung Koi was a bit like that, if I recall. I mean, I think a lot of people really didn't want him doing that to him in the streets.
Actually, Jared probably can talk to that more than I.
Persistence pays off. I mean, geez, water through the rock,
In terms of Ueshiba, he was controversial at the time. He's still a little bit controversial even now, for a lot of reasons, one of which being nobody else in, I'm going to say about 300 years of Japanese martial arts recently has spawned so many students who then went on to create new martial arts. That's not kosher normally in Japan. You learn and you follow the mold, and you might, if you're really brazen, say, well, this is the Judkins style of the Eisner style of this thing, but to start a brand new martial art is a little out of hand. And if you look at the relationship between Ueshiba and his own teacher, Sokaku Takeda, he all indications are that Takeda didn't really care for Ueshiba toward the end of his own life, because he's got this guy has a history of being rough and tumble. He has no problem going around roughing people up all the time. And he's also a religious fanatic who's a member of a cult, right? And he wants to completely overhaul the entire system without a lot of hard direction, right? People forget Ueshiba didn't really formulate the Aikido that we have now. Ueshiba's son did, right? Ueshiba himself was just going around and, I don't know, this, and then people would try to figure out what he did. So his students, in their own correspondence and writing, talked about how frustrating it was. His students weren't greenhorns. They all came to his dojo almost to a man with high level expertise in judo, in kendo, classical jiu-jitsu, all kinds of stuff. Some of them were pro wrestlers and boxers and all kinds of things. They came to Ueshiba because he himself had some kind of preternatural capability, by all accounts. I've not personally seen any evidence of that. I've never met an Aikido-ka who could chuck me around all that well, even my own teacher. So then the question for all these guys was, how did he do it, right? At that point, it's more Houdini than Dewey, because he wasn't a great teacher. He was just somehow had this weird ability.
So it comes down to maybe a little bit of the cult of personality thing.
Definitely. Plus, the religious chanting and stuff probably helped. Although almost none of his students got involved in the Omotokyo religion, which is really interesting to me. Only in recent years has there been a little bit of resurgence of interest in learning more about it and its relationship with Aikido, and almost all the people doing that are American.
Interesting. So maybe we all just need to be crazy madmen to be authentic. There's something about being a little crazy about pushing the boundaries and establishing something, or establishing one's own authenticity. I think you got it somewhere.
Right.
Well, this has me wondering about. Let's look at a totally different example of someone who seems to be authentic based on merit alone. Greg Jackson, the MMA coach. The dude has very little in the way of his own training that seems to be legit, and yet he turns out monsters. In fact, for a while, he gave I can't remember what he called it. He had a funky quasi-Japanese name for whatever he was trying to do. But he himself doesn't hold rank or anything in any arts, and I don't think he ever even fought professionally. So then does Greg Jackson, is he authentic based entirely on skill, or?
Well, maybe that's that skill thing again. Maybe he just has a way of perceiving and driving people to their potential. Man, that's an authentic skill. That's hard to do.
It is a special case of a general phenomenon, which is that coaches, really top successful coaches, were only rarely star athletes. I mean, if you look at the NFL, how many of our top football coaches were also top quarterbacks? You know, most of them had distinctly middling careers and then went on to do something utterly spectacular, right? Which again gets us back to that fundamental slipperiness, right? And what is the relationship again between authenticity and creativity, right? Because, you know, a lot of us are invested in the notion of fantasy, right? And what fantasy gives you is open ground for creativity.
Correct.
True.
Right. And so I think that this is the real rub. It's, you know, authenticity versus creativity. If we're looking at this in a strictly Confucian framework, that is a no-no. And yet, for martial arts to continue to exist in the world, people have got to identify problems and creatively address them in every single generation, and then pretend that it never happened, and we have always done it this way.
In regards to creativity, I think creativity gets thrown around a lot, like in the sense of like, I'm just gonna be spontaneous and that's creative, and that's cool. Right. However, when it comes to art, there's a reason my dad gets up every morning and draws cubes and triangles and egg shapes for like a half hour first thing in the morning as a visual artist. There's a reason when I get up in the morning, I practice my stances right when I roll out of bed. There's a reason that we practice our scales. There's a reason why we practice counterpoint. There's a reason why Caravaggio's art looks the way it is. There's a reason why West Canadian African rhythms are the way they are and embodied through everybody who practices them. I mean, there's a reason why the gamma runs to, you know, a half a tone off from each other. And so, and all of those things have a form and there's creativity within it. To just blatantly vomit out resource or capital isn't creativity. And I think that's where people make a mistake. You can be loud and you can draw a little something or play a little something, and that is creativity. However, is it creativity that surpasses surface beauty, or is it creativity that just knocks on surface beauty? And as a practitioner, where do you judge that yourself?
Mm-hmm. I have a pretty systematic approach to creativity because, you know, I'm a writer, and writing only happens when you sit down at a keyboard and spend hours and hours doing it. And if you're going to spend hours and hours doing it, you don't want to F this up.
That's right.
So you generally have a game plan ahead of time as to where you're going to go with it. And I think creativity in not just the martial arts, but let's say in yoga, in any embodied practice, is kind of the same thing. Creativity is fundamentally a type of research. And a colleague of mine, you know, an acquaintance named Ben Spatz, who is a theater professor. He's, you know, kind of a, you know, protege of Daniel Mraz, who's not here with us tonight, but is also associated with TPLA. You know, Ben Spatz has written an entire book that is really centered around the notion of how, as we go through and experience physical technique in our practice, it's not just rote repetition, but we are doing kind of systematic research on this question of what can a body do? And as we practice, we learn things about what a body can do that are different than what we knew before. And at some point, they're also different from what our teacher knew. Mm-hmm. And that is when you begin to kind of creatively innovate in martial arts, right? Creativity doesn't happen outside of the strictures of practice. Generally speaking, creativity is something that is actually driven by practice, right? Practice is the fuel that you shovel into, that furnace that allows for innovation, later.
Well, one would hope. One would hope. But, that
Well, I mean, this is Spatz's essential point: is that you can't stop it from happening. As you experience your body, you come to understand it in progressively different and different ways. So yeah.
Yeah. And back to what you were saying too at the top, Damon, is that a lot of people, especially novices, when they first start into martial arts, I'm guilty of it. I'm sure other people are guilty of it too. We put so much weight on being creative, like it's some secret weapon. Like, how many times have we heard this, that the beginners are more dangerous than experts because they're unpredictable? It's like, no, they're not. They are people who you should not underestimate because they're unpredictable. But if you're a master, you should have zero trouble taking care of them.
I'm reminded. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead, Jerry.
Well, I'm reminded of a legend, may or may not be true, about Jigoro Kano, the guy who invented judo. There's a technique in judo called the Kata Guruma, the shoulder wheel, and if you look at it, it's pretty obviously a fireman's carry, right? Thing is, aesthetically, fireman's carry doesn't really fit into classical jujitsu, at least not the styles he was learning. But he, according to legend, we don't know how much of this is verified. He checks out a book on wrestling, sees the technique, adapts it to his style, and then the next time he goes into the dojo, he uses it to defeat his own teacher, who promptly issues him a license to teach, and that's the beginning of judo.
Interesting.
So now, Kata Guruma is seen as a classical judo technique. It's well known, everybody uses it, it's very effective. You'll see it in the Olympics next year if they happen. But they don't always talk about how that's not a classical jujutsu technique. And maybe we'll just kind of slide that underneath the welcome mat and forget that he ever had to read a book to learn a new technique like that.
Well, it's hard to acknowledge that. I think in the past, people were people too, right? And what happens is, I think that story, Jared, which is really cool, it humanizes Jigoro Kano's experience as a martial artist and makes him relatable to us. That's a really relatable story. I think about when I left the Medford Judo Academy and I went and studied things, and I came back and they're like, well, Damon, why don't you teach part of class tonight and show everybody this? I thought that was like incredible. And it was just like, wow, like there is an evolution that happened. And I'm great friends with those people. They're my family, but that story is that thing. New knowledge enters into something and it expands and intensifies. And then somewhere in that expansion and intensification, we want to forget that humanizing story of coming back and doing something different or sharing things or going on a, you know what I mean? Because it's easier to put it on the horizon than it is to look at it really close to us.
Well, that makes me question, like, what do we think is the intersection of creativity and solving problems with, like, following some kind of an established tradition or whatever
Mistake.
through line?
Mistake. Well, I look at it like this. It's like guidelines, and somebody put this very, very well at some place. I can't remember where, but they said, if you put out good guidelines, you're basically, anybody that follows those guidelines is behaving as if they are an expert. If you get an expert to write a bunch of guidelines and say, do this step, this step, this step, this step, this step, you can take many tasks and have people perform the task as if they were an expert without having any knowledge of it, just by following the rules, right? And I think that's what people are striving for that thing. And it does hold true, right? People, like the traditional systems, have a lot of knowledge and experience behind them. They may have solved these problems before, calling them something different, having a totally different, you know, whatever. But then there's this, and this intersects with the creativity thing, right? Is we often think of creativity of the act of spontaneously coming up with stuff, right? But there's a creativity in thinking too. Like I was trying, I've explained this to my or talked about this with my brother-in-law, who's a research scientist, right? Saying, you know, oh, he wishes he could be creative. I said, well, you're creative too. You know, you have to design these experiments to come up with these solutions. You have to come up with these questions. You have, you know, that's all creative, right? When you are, go back to, you know, like being a novice and you come in, you don't have anything to go on, right? So you take the system, whatever you're given, and you just kind of do it for rote, and you see what works, and you start to, you know, all that kind of thing in there. And I think it's at that point that authenticity becomes very important to us, because we want to make sure that we're doing something really good. Unfortunately, we don't drop that after it becomes baggage, right? Where at a certain point, that type of thinking does not do you any more good. It's diminishing returns, right? Where you're going to start stifling progress, and then it becomes just doing things over and over and over again. And that, I think, and I'll just put this out here, is one of the real reasons why, like, a lot of the traditional martial arts are not doing well. It's because the people who've been doing them have just been kind of going through the motions for a long time, and have kind of just gotten real absent-minded with everything, right? Now you can take new knowledge and new experience and bring it in there and try to ferret out what was there, you know. But again, that takes creativity. And if we're going to make this distinction between being creative and being authentic, right, isn't creativity the authentic procedure?
It is definitely part of authenticity. I think it would be like stuck doing Fuchs or Bach counterpoint all your life. And as important as those things were for me to study in composition school, you know, they inform my ability to create music that is completely different tonality and harmony and rhythm structure than what they dealt with back then, or what they created back then. And they were systems to deal with things that came before. So then you have like stages and you have states. So it's like, if we look at something that's at a certain stage, that's also like complexity, right? Our world is so complex now that immediately, even when you are a beginner, everything that you come into that space with is incredibly challenged. There's no container or constraint for you to just focus on that one skill without being challenged from all directions. And I think that can be really, really frustrating for students. And I know it was frustrating for me, because everybody go, all that stuff, everyone has an opinion. You're like, wait, I'm just practicing. And that's also a beginner's mind to beginners, beginner to beginner to beginner, is they're quabbling back and forth rather than just practicing.
Right.
It's kind of like shutting up, and I mean, for lack of a better term, just like be quiet and practice.
Right.
And then the state that you're in goes through different stages, right? So it becomes this kind of line rather than, you know, and it intensifies, expands. And the longer you're in something, the more intensification you need before it expands, and the greater depth you have. In the beginning, it always seems like it's fast.
Right.
You're just really just kind of learning how to walk.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and that's why I often say to people, I don't want people to do a lot of freeform. Like, I don't see value in, other than like a cardio warm up, by just doing random techniques and stuff like that in a string. That's not creative to me, because again, there may be some cardio value or something like that in there, but that's not really it. But
Well, I think
let's
also, Chad, to address that point, I think a lot of people think creativity has to have a goal,
right,
and it doesn't.
right.
You know, and the act of going through random motions as a warm-up is enough to inform some practice to get ready to have tools later because it embodies it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's definitely a point there where it's like, oh, well, don't attach yourself to the outcomes of that. However, don't cease to practice it because its value is warming your body up. And as you get more and more and more, those things will become more refined. And then all of a sudden, those things that you thought were unessential might have been in you a long time to come out and create something different.
Mm-hmm. I would argue that often more comes out, like Ben was saying, in a practice scenario than like when you're just kind of randomly throwing stuff out. Although when you go random, that's a good way to kind of see, okay, how creative can I be? Film yourself, right? Because like if you're a fighter, film yourself doing some like imagining some random scenarios and stuff like that with your attacks. Shoot yourself and watch yourself and see how many times you repeat the same sequence over and over and over again without even knowing it.
Yeah, free flow challenges your vocabulary.
Yeah. So a lot of people,
really important if you want to learn how to speak well.
Yeah. But so anyway, I wanted to switch gears a little bit here to talk about the other side of the equation, which is the fake, right? So how are we deeming things as fake, and what exactly does that mean? Right now we have that whole big argument with like the MMA versus traditional martial arts and all of that, and where does that come? And I think before we go, we have to touch on the patron saint of fake martial arts, something that goes far beyond any Tai Chi master out there trying to push people over and everything like that. Count Dante, the guy that you saw in the back of the comic books, the most dangerous man alive. This hairdresser from Chicago somehow convinced an entire generation of kids that he could kill you with 2 fingers.
Was he really a hairdresser?
Yeah.
Huh.
He was a hairdresser, he was a used car salesman, he owned a chain of pornography shops, and he once tried to start up a hometown Chicago brand of cigarettes marketed as Count Dante cigarettes.
Wow, what a very interesting entrepreneur.
Renaissance man.
Oh, indeed.
I don't know what it is about that generation and strange martial artists in the adult film industry.
Well, for people who don't know, Jared, why don't you
hanging out in Van Nuys, California?
Why don't you kind of bring us up to bring viewers who don't know who Count Dante is kind of up to date about the character of Count Dante?
In my estimation, Count Dante, whose birth name was John Keehan, if you're looking through Chicago birth records, his father was a doctor, like a physician, and his mother variously worked in different locations, possibly at a bank, possibly as a homemaker. It's kind of unclear. We should preface with, we call him Count Dante for a few reasons. One of those being he later took on the alias Count Dante, and toward the end of his active time as a martial arts promoter, he legally changed his name to Count Juan Rafael Dante. And according to some accounts, which have not been verified or discounted either direction, thanks to bureaucracy, he may or may not have legally purchased the title of Count from the Spanish government, which was in a bit of a bind at the time economically. John Keehan is from Chicago, and we have to lay out 2 parallel tracks when talking about Count Dante Keehan, because there's the account of life according to Count Dante, and there's actual reality. And these don't always match up, and sometimes they diverge wildly. But this the life he put out as who he was is the basis for things like Bloodsport or Street Fighter. he is the inspiration for so much of martial arts media. We owe a ton to this man, including organizing the first nationwide martial arts contest in the United States and founding the American Karate Association, which is still the largest, most active organization for karate in the United States today. He claimed to have become a Marine at the age of 17, lying about his birth record so that he could march off and go to war or whatever he lived out in his fantasies. In reality, he seems to have signed up when he was 18 or 19, and he seems to have also been stationed in the US doing nothing for 2 years before being discounted on medical. He somehow in here became a student of Robert Trias, who opened the first martial arts, he opened the first karate school in the mainland US and Arizona. So he was flying back and forth. We're not entirely sure how frequently, but with some degree of regularity between Chicago and Arizona to learn karate. Somehow, in under 3 years, he earns a black belt from
Jared,
Trias.
when was this? Wait, can we have a timeline when he was flying? I don't know why that's important. Was it like 70s or something?
Most of his activities in the 60s.
60s, okay, thanks.
Early to mid 60s. And the weird part is that he eventually just disappears, and we're not entirely sure if he's dead or alive, which is pretty fitting for a guy like this. So he learned karate from Trias.
Didn't you say he was responsible for a lot of martial arts media? Maybe he got like sucked into Double Dragon, dude. Like Tron style. Sorry.
Now he's going around with Bimmy and Jimmy, driving a car that is powered entirely on garbage. Yeah, it's possible. He claimed to have fought in death matches all over the world, but mostly in Southeast Asia, pit fighting, that sort of thing. To have fought in various kumite, which later Frank Dukes would crib and use as his life story, which was the real basis for that film. But all of those guys end up taking their stories from Count Dante. But in reality, he did organize martial arts tournaments, and they were massive dog and pony shows in and around the Midwest primarily. He ended up being involved in the famous dojo wars of the 60s, somehow rubbing just about everybody he met the wrong way, and may or may not have killed a man with a sword. Which is actually the first conversation you and I ever had, Jed.
Wow.
Yeah. I know somebody who claims to have been in the room when that incident happened. He said it wasn't Count Dante, but somebody did get stabbed with a martial arts sword taken off the wall. Not even like so here we go. So here is the Neapolitan Sunday of authenticity and fraud that is Count Dante, right? Because you have a guy who, as you said, has created a bunch of actual organizations. Some of them still are robust today, right? You've got a guy who legitimately, started lots and lots and lots of violent trouble, right? And if we can believe the stories, a man is dead from a fake sword. It's so delicious. It's wonderful. We are very, very surprised. We won't talk about that. But anyway, yes. So, and then that's the thing. It's like, where, was he the most dangerous man alive? He could have been, maybe not because of his martial arts, but because he's just a complete nut. But
the thing is, he also claimed to teach martial arts that he himself would never have been exposed to. He's most famous for spreading the idea of the dim mak, right? Nobody in the US had ever heard of dim mak until
I remember
Dante.
the back of the comic books, dude.
Yeah.
Touch.
But the most he could possibly have studied martial art before teaching the dim mak was up to, generously, maybe 3 years of the occasional weekend trip to Arizona to learn Shotokan. Which Trias didn't call Shotokan, by the way. He calls it Shude style, which I find very interesting, but that's another matter. And claimed to have learned it from a man with a Korean name.
Is where did he get this idea of Denmark in general? And he just wanted to roll with it.
Oh, I bet he got it from the movies.
I think he was cribbing a lot from you know how at the beginning of a cookbook, there's always a little bit of an essay portion where they talk about the history of the food and the culture surrounding it?
Yeah.
You'll notice that a lot of the instructional martial arts booklets that came out of the 40s and 50s also tend to have that same section at the beginning, especially the ones by Bruce Tegner. And I'm pretty sure he just stole a bunch of ideas from Tegner.
Yeah, that could be. I remember those little books that Tegner put out.
I have some of them in the other room.
Yeah, I have some of them somewhere too. They're
weird. Tegner himself was an interesting guy. I once got a call pretty late at night from my mentor while I was working on the manuscript for the book saying, "We forgot to put in Tegner. You need a chapter on Tegner." So I'm frantically writing a thing about Tegner because it was like 7 days before I had to turn it in.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think he probably was cribbing from other martial arts experts at the time, and he found a way to create an image. And if you look at him as an icon, I have one of the ads pulled up, but I guess we're not doing screen share. Can you?
So Jared, it's a bit of cult of personality, isn't it?
It's the definition of it, man. Like,
yeah.
This guy, so he was a perfect storm, as you say, Chad. He had the image, he had the mystique. He didn't call his group like, South Side Chicago Karate Club. He called it the Black Dragon Fighting Society, a name that he took from, we don't know which one, but it had to have been a history book about the relatively recently concluded conflict between the Chinese and the Japanese that preceded World War II. The reason I say that being, anybody who has read much about the Sino-Japanese War knows that the Heilongjiang was, that's the Black Dragon River, and there was a Black Dragon Society in Japan, but it sounds cool. It sounds like, hardcore martial arts guys. But in fact, it was a bunch of rich people and politicians who were just funding an unjust war and, using kind of dirty tactics to get what they wanted. And the Black Dragon River, or Amur River, depending on which book you're reading, is the source. That's like a dividing line that they were like, we're going to stake our claim in China up to this point. It's like calling it the Louisiana Purchase Society. But it's interesting that he then takes that, he catches just that little piece, and he creates the Black Dragon Fighting Society with the secrets of Dim Mak, the Death Touch, and then he's selling these booklets. And he calls himself, and did we get screen share up? Because I've got the...
Oh, no, I can't.
Man, it's like grain of sand tipping the scale, man. Just right where to put it, put that grain of sand right at that fulcrum right place.
So he's got this, it's a Chinese delivery menu thing where they try to have 120 different options. Let me read you some of the copy from his most famous comic book ad. Bringing you these forbidden and secret fighting arts is the Supreme Grand Master, in all caps, of all the fighting arts, Count Dante, who won the World Overall Fighting Arts Championship, whatever that is. And then in parentheses, Master and Expert divisions, after defeating the top judo, boxing, wrestling, karate, gung fu, aikido, kung fu, etc. masters in death matches. On August 1st, 1967, World Fighting Federation, Fighting Arts Council, you can predict the rest.
Yeah, so for people wondering why I'm laughing here, and Ben and Damon are too, is Gong Fu is just another way to write Kung Fu. That's the way he wrote it twice.
And so this is why we love Count Dante. Because,
yes, this is definitely why we love Count Dante, and we should never forget him.
Right.
He would. So
it's a great lesson to hubris, and it's an incredible great lesson to the power of personality and assumptions and denial. It's beautiful.
Yep.
I do want to clarify, by the way, you mentioned earlier, Damon, the weird connection with pornography. He was a hairdresser for Playboy, so you can tell where his machinations lay.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Well,
interesting.
there you go. I mean, and yeah, right on.
So he's this perfect storm of creating a sense of authenticity, because yeah, okay, he's a white guy, but he grows out an afro. Okay, so he's got a little bit of that late 60s kind of hip to it mentality going on. You know, and Bruce Lee and Jim Kelly are coming right down the pike, right? But he's wearing usually some kind of femme fu, like, you know, traditional Chinese clothing, or a karate uniform, but it looks a little different and more exotic, and it has bells and whistles on it. And this is before, like, you know, the Kempo karate guys come along and start adding lots of patches and stuff. Right. So seeing a karate uniform that's been customized, oh, that's a little weird. And I don't know these organizations, but they sound interesting, right? Mm-hmm. And then years later, guys like Ashita Kim will take it and run and do their Black Dragon thing too. But it's interesting that this confluence of different things and the creation of a mystique and not giving full information, right? Just, I learned from mysterious masters in the East, back when you could pull off Orientalism, that gives people enough sense of authenticity for him to attract thousands of folks to his tournaments.
You know, it's kind of like elevator music. It's like it's everywhere, and and you know, we're always surrounded by sound. However, if you really listen, you know what I mean? Like, you have to train yourself to listen. Like, you have to train yourself to get through. I don't know why I thought that was a little kind of off from Neptune coming from.
Well, we are talking about Count Dante, so that's not unusual.
Well, the music things, it makes me think of that story about Robert Johnson. Mm-hmm. You know, that he had such supernatural guitar abilities that he must have sold his soul. And it's not like Johnson was going around correcting people. Son House told that story, and then Johnson kind of runs with it as an advertising gimmick, you know. Mm-hmm. I have to wonder if that's if that sense of secrecy, that, I mean, Count Dante.
Hey, everybody loves a mystery.
It's true.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do, you know, and when something's mysterious, it's kind of easier to assume and have your own stuff about it rather than have a relationship with cognitive information that can maybe shatter that mystery a little bit. Mysteries and stories are important. However, when they override your better judgment,
And I think that's a really good point, because I think one time that authenticity, and we'll kind of wrap it up here with this one, but one time that authenticity comes into the conversation all the time is when people are watching people do stuff that they themselves cannot do. Either it's like acrobatic, fancy, all that kind of stuff. Maybe they're a beginner at fighting, so they get in there and they can't make their techniques work, right? Because they just don't have enough experience. And like we're talking about before, authenticity has zero to do with skill, right? You can have the most inauthentic method, but your skill can be off the charts, right? So, you know, there's that. I think that comes up a lot, is that authenticity is something that people can fall back on in the absence of some other things. And like I said, when we start out and we're novices, that serves us to keep us practicing, right? To keep us, you know, working.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're kind of really going at the point of like all of a sudden when you realize what you don't know, you realize really you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
It gets just huge. Like the bottom, there's just so much out there. And you're right, there's a lot of value judgments about people doing great athletic things and be like, oh, well, that's just because this person doesn't do the same technique the way I do. However, they have this great ability.
Yeah.
Right?
And yeah, people can use that. You know, well, at least mine's authentic. You know,
Right.
but
And
I think
age has a lot to do with it too. As I get older, I see a lot of this next generation of martial artists, and some of these martial artists are super athletic
oh yeah, yeah,
kids.
no, everything.
And it's impressive to see. And
Oh, yeah.
and there's all this tricking and stuff. And I mean, I think it's beautiful and cool to watch. My only question is what are they going to do when they're old?
Oh God.
It's like I know from working with gymnasts and professional dancers and everything and circus people that like when you push your body that hard, you can easily have irreparable damage the rest of your life.
It's
So
almost
it's going to be really interesting to see this generation age.
no, it's almost assured, right? My wushu teacher Ma Chao was 23 years old when I knew him, and he had both of his knees reconstructed already. Wow, so you can, and when we asked him to teach for him to teach us doing a tornado kick and landing on the kicking foot, he refused. He said, land in horse stance. You don't even mess with that. It'll destroy you.
That's interesting because my training, I started touring internationally at the age of 30 as a dancer, which is old.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the way I trained in martial arts, I was able to do that. So it was like weird. It was the opposite. Like I didn't have those. That's a later conversation.
Yeah, but I think because I know this about really, really top level ballet dancers too. My friend growing up in high school, she was a ballet dancer and her mother was a ballet dancer. And I mean like a big ballet dancer, right? And she was now a coach, a teacher, because nothing worked no more. I mean, she did, all that toe stuff is just murder on your joints. And
you get busted up doing that kind of stuff. So
it's one of those sacrifices, right? It's a lot of sports have those things where you take this and you say, I'm going to have a limited career here. Like football. Nobody ever talks about this, but you're like, what happens to football players when they age out of the game? Because that is definitely a young man's game, right? You're not going to be playing, that kind of game when you're my age. And if you are, whew.
I think this is the concept of old man strength and how to train as you get older. That needs to be a discussion that we have as well. Because of all the practical takeaways it can have. I mean,
Jared.
We've all screwed up enough that we have a lot of practical idea. And I think in terms of the present discussion with authenticity, we should probably come up with a couple of practical points that people can take away for their own training, right? So I mean, what are the lessons learned?
I would say, from my point of view, well, why don't I start out with you guys? Ben, why don't you give it a go? What's the point that you want people to take away from this to their own practice from this discussion?
Never ask about authenticity unless you have specified ahead of time what you're interested in, right? Basically, authenticity is a term that's used to con people in martial arts discussions unless you're being very, very specific about the skill or the relationship that you are interested in. But it doesn't really apply to anything outside of that one thing that you're going to specify.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Who wants to go?
I'll go. I think my takeaway for people is also know what you personally value in your journey with this. I feel like today it's really hard to practice because we have so many distractions, and be realistic with your vision and your goals and its relationship to what you think is authentic and attainable. We all don't walk off into the sunset.
Mm-hmm. Jared.
I'm going to say, piggybacking off of that, know the people with whom you're going to be spending time, because you're going to be more like them. Is this a teacher you respect as a person, or are you trying to make them a fictional character? And it's okay if you want to have some suspension of disbelief. I know people who do recreational pro wrestling as they would any other sport or martial art, and there is nothing wrong with that, because it's fun and it's awesome and it gets you moving. But just question what draws you to any given activity, martial arts or otherwise. What is it you really like about it, and why?
Yeah. For me, I'm thinking most people get hung up on authenticity. And as we've been discussing, it doesn't have a whole lot of relation to anything real unless you have some sort of dynamic already set up, right? Like you're saying, okay, did this really come from this place? Now that's what you're talking about when you're talking about authentic. Does it teach you real skill, authentic skill? That's an entirely different sense of the word of authentic, right? And it's going to have totally different criteria to judge it on. And you always have to know that. So try not to get drawn into the ideas perpetuated by that argument of, is it authentic, is it not, right? As they've been saying, what do you want out of it? Can it give you that, right? Do you like the people involved with it, right? These are the important questions, right? And those are the questions that are not asked when we just throw things into a bucket of authenticity or fraud, right? And as we've been saying, the fraud aspect of it is sort of a misnomer. Not everything that they're talking about is fraud, right? So.
Yeah, I think you bring it right. I mean, we're all responsible for our own integrity, and us as students and teachers. I think, Jared, what you said, surrounding yourself with the people you more or less want to somewhat become. I mean, that's important, and that's something not really talked about that much either. That's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think next week is that's probably a good idea if we talk about those the issues that you were talking about, Jared, with some of those safety and all of that kind of thing that comes in there. So we will be back again at it next week here on SwordLab to continue. Continue a conversation that we kind of brought up in this one. But we'll put out some more things for you as the date comes up. We are coming up on July, which means we're coming up on our 7-Form Symposium. We will have more information coming out about that pretty soon. That's on July 4th, so on the holiday. I know a lot of places are still closed down. If you're trying to stay socially distant and stuff like that, be socially distant with us. We will be distant in that sense.
Training never closes.
Right, exactly. So with all of that being said, we'll see you this weekend if you're gonna stick around for Saber Academy. It's tomorrow. Thank you to my panel members here for the discussion. Thank you for joining us here at home or on the interwebs or wherever you are enjoying us, even after the fact. So I will leave you there. Patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.